Good morning, everybody. I'm also happy to be back. I remember I was at the very first AIM conference and the several subsequent, and I was very sick when I did it. And now I just have a very small cold, so the circle closes it on a much better level. As Zach has mentioned, and as undoubtedly all of you are aware, these days you cannot escape energy. It's everywhere in all our minds and in all our Twitter accounts. But it's in there in a very different way from what it was just a year ago or after COP26 in Glasgow, when all the talk was about how the energy transition could be accelerated and would proceed. Nowadays, as you know, it's all about disruptions. It's all about how fossil fuels could be multiplied, how could they be shipped to different places to fix these disruptions, how the system could be made more secure, and it's all really concentrated on fossil fuels. This whole debate between energy security and energy transition is something which is new and which, at least in the short term, has been won by people who worry about fossil fuels. I remember, I'm long enough in the industry, when the standard presentation would be energy security, and up would come a slide which would say it's about availability of energy, affordability of energy, and about sustainability. These days, it's more likely to be people talking about availability and affordability, and other people separately talking about sustainability. So what I want to ask, what everybody wants to know, government people, investors, private sector people, energy people, customers, is will what we're seeing right now, this energy crisis in the wake of the war in the Ukraine, be a catalyst for a faster transition? Because obviously the fossil fuel system didn't really work out too well when push comes to shove. Or will it be slowing down the energy transition? Because realistically, it can't be done and we will need fossil fuels because otherwise the light goes out. The answer will be that yes, it will slow down the energy transition, but hopefully will also make it more successful by slowing it down for the right reasons. Now, before I go straight into the question, it's going to be the only slide of content, don't worry. I was planning to do it completely without. Let me step back, because I think it still always pays to think 1 minute what we are talking about when we're talking about the global energy system. Energy is the one thing, I always say, which goes directly or indirectly into any kind of economic activity you can think of, anywhere. You may say it's like labor, but labor also needs energy to sustain itself. If you now step back a little, so the consequence, of course, is that we have an energy system which is huge, which is vast, slow-moving, and very complicated, needless to say. When I say energy, by the way, I mean primary fuels, coal, oil, gas, sun, hydro, water, the primary fuels which are in there, wind. When you step back in history, you will also discover that this energy transition is truly unique. It has never happened before. Even if we define an energy transition as loosely as possible, as just switching the dominant fuel, we had only 2 of them in history, even if we do it this way. The first one is the switch from wood or from biomass to coal in the 18th century, and the second one is the switch from coal to oil as the dominant fuel in the 20th century. And there cannot be any doubt that both of these transitions have been driven by economics, by comparative advantage, and by being integrated into broader economic changes. Coal, the fuel of the Industrial Revolution, it's not called a revolution for nothing. And then oil replacing coal wasn't focused on the transport sector at first. It was replacing coal because it had better properties, higher energy density, easier ways of transporting it, finding it. It was more economic to use. This is clearly not the case right now. My iPhone works perfectly well with power generated by coal. Even if some people claim it, there's no automatic link between the so-called digital revolution and the energy transition. And yes, it's true, wind and solar in some places are now cheaper than fossil fuels in power generation, but this is not how they started out. They came to that result, and we have to ask how it was accomplished to learn from it, but it's not the starting point. Nobody started the energy transition anywhere because there were more competitive fuels. So that's just an illustration how giant the task is. Now the next question is, what I'm going to argue is that we have some illustrations in the current energy crisis and in the war of the Ukraine, which show us exactly what the problem is with replacing the existing fossil fuels with renewables. Intellectually speaking, the central issue here is that most of us, for too long, have or are still assuming that this is a problem of substitution. Out with the old fossil, in with the new clean energy. And this is the energy transition. The faster you can do it, the better, of course. The reality is that the gap between them in economic performance is still so large, and the energy system is so large, that this is much more a problem of what economists call complementarities. How to build islands of clean energy into this ocean of fossil fuels. How to get the two systems, the old and the new, to work together to bring down aggregate emissions. It was just an illusion to think we could just replace one with the other. It's not going to be that simple. And the current situation provides some pretty obvious illustrations for that, which I want to run through before I talk about the lessons. When you think about how fuels compete, clean and fossil fuels, think about issues we all know about. You know, the transportability of a fuel is important, storability is important, diversity in uses, you know, is important, versatility is important. When you look now at the consequences of the energy crisis, look at something simple like versatility. I've been in the energy sector a long time, and I was truly amazed to what an extent oil could replace gas, for example, as an industrial fuel feedstock in Europe. To what an extent coal could replace gas as a source of heating in many parts of the world when prices went crazy. To what an extent different fossil fuels and renewables can substitute for each other in power generation, the only area where they all can compete. Now, this is important because we don't have the same kind of versatility for renewables. They are much more specialized, I would argue. Think about simple things like transportability. There is this view that actually one should always produce the fuels one uses at home, ideally with renewables, because then you don't need to import anything. You're not dependent on some bad guys somewhere in the East, and all of this would not. This was always a very dubious view. Think of Fukushima, think of a place like Japan. Suppose they had only nuclear power and renewables to take off the nuclear power, it would have been a disaster. Why? Because you cannot transport the wind and the sun across borders, only in the derived form of high voltage energy and things like that. And what we are seeing now is an illustration. You are probably aware that when Russia cut off natural gas supplies for Europe, it has been compensated for by importing a lot of liquefied natural gas. But the orders of magnitude are incredible to fathom. The whole amount of additional liquefied natural gas imports into Europe is just one small share of the whole energy system, is equivalent to more than half of the European production of power with renewable energy. Over one summer, an increase in imports equivalent to what has been built over a decade or longer. Storage system. Everyone is aware, again, of the problem which we have with clean energy, that it has to be stored and how difficult it is to solve this. And of course, the competitive advantage for fossil fuels in that area is obvious. But when you look at the numbers again, storage for natural gas in Europe over the course of the war, over the last 8 months, has gone up by about 75 BCM. Translated into dollars, that means about $60 billion. If you were to take the same amount of energy equivalent, store it in batteries with current technology, we're talking about a magnitude of $100 trillion. So those are the dimensions and those are the differences here, which should give all of us pause for thought and to worry about how not, don't shoot the messenger. I'm not saying this because I'm saying it's hopeless with clean energy. I'm saying this, we have to be a bit smarter about it than we have been in the past. What, if these are illustrations, what are then some of the lessons which we can take from the energy transition? And I give you just 3 ones, which I think are pretty central and which are sort of important enough to draw some conclusions from it. The first one is just a reality check. There will be no energy transition without energy security. That's what we are seeing here. And unfortunately, as of yet, there will not be energy security without fossil fuels. If that's a lesson, what follows from it? It probably follows, number one, that we have to be very, again, smart in how we complement these two things and advance which kind of fossil fuels. It does make a difference whether you use coal or gas to supplement wind or the sun. And it follows from it that the system has to become more robust. The redundancy in the global energy system is very low. These markets are always very tight. And precisely because everybody needs it, everybody depends on low prices. So we need to blow it up to an extent where redundancy improves, where it becomes more robust. One of the ways we can do that, and the second kind of lesson which I would draw from that, it's a bit clumsily written, is basically the message, don't neglect economics, basic economics, 101 economics. I wrote here demand and supply for a reason. First of all, we all live in market economies. And market economy, most of us anyway, market economies are demand constrained. If you want more of something, a sports shoe or a Mercedes or whatever, you will get it. If there isn't enough of that something, the price will go up and you will get it. Resources will be allocated. If it can't be produced good or fast enough, investments will be undertaken. Technology will improve in that area. The constraint is demand. But now, if you start fussing around on the supply side, and you're saying, okay, I know what these people need, but I cut down on the production of oil, on the production of gas, on the production of something else, then beware, you may encounter the law of unintended consequences. You cannot disrupt supplies without taking care of demand at the same time. It's dangerous. I am hearing this now for decades. Let's pause a little bit. In the energy market, in the oil market, when you talk about, when OPEC talks about high prices and so on, you always hear that story, there's an investment gap. These bad companies don't invest enough. And so I, for one, have been a constant skeptic of this hypothesis that there's an investment gap. Sorry? Can you not hear me? You have to tell me. Okay. I have been a skeptic of this constant hypothesis that there's an investment gap in energy. But now for the first time, I think the numbers bear it out. We had these campaigns against the financing in fossil fuels. We had these campaigns against, related to the EG investments. And so I don't want to argue against the moral case for it. Again, don't shoot the messenger. But it did probably leave a gap for which we are now paying higher prices than we otherwise would have. So to be smart, to use basic economics, not to neglect them, is something people have always said, and it relates to the third point. We have these two parts of the system, the clean one and the fossil one. We need to make the clean one bigger. To some extent, that requires of them working together. To some extent, it just requires for the clean ones to become competitive. How do we do that? Rule number one would be you have competition policy, you can create level playing fields, all of that, but rule number one would be, of course, by using the price mechanism. Very old hypothesis, price carbon, and it will be squeezed out much faster from the system. Now, these are lessons, high-level qualitative implications, but what does it mean for an investor? What does it mean for each of us who wants to put the chips sort of on the right development? In order to get that, we need to do one last thing. And I'm actually very surprised that this is not done more often. We need to take these kind of qualitative lessons and put them in the world to which they will be applied. And most likely that is the world after the energy crisis. Most likely that is the world after the war in the Ukraine. And you hear very, very little how this world looks like, even though I think that we actually know a lot about how the world looks like. We have to be clear about this. At some point, the war will be over. I don't say how it would be. It could be a frozen conflict like Ukraine. It could be, God forbid, a landscape blighted by scars of weapons of mass destruction. But at some point, people will no longer call the situation a war. They won't use that word anymore. That's what I'm talking about. Let's assume it takes place not in 5 or 10 years, but in 2 or 3 years, so that we can make some predictions. Then I think with some confidence, you can say a number of things about how this world will look like. The first one is, most likely, this will be a world in which fossil fuels are cheap relative to the past and relative to today. Why? Because the price cycle will have turned, because we have gone through years of high prices, and they will create an increase in supply because the system will rebalance. All these kind of sanctions will disappear. The huge distortions when oil is shipped to faraway places and coal to other places and so on will be rationalized again, and fossil fuel prices, more likely than not, are sort of mean reverting, or even if the traditional cycle applies, becoming lower than that. Two, I think this is something which we now have seen in Egypt. Last time we showed the messenger. The Paris climate targets, the 1.5 and the 2% target, will be officially or semi-officially in the public discussion, discarded. It's already in the numbers. I mean, nobody really seriously doing the numbers can claim that we will reach 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius, even if you believe in that story that a certain amount of CO2 emissions needlessly and linearly translates into 1.5, 1.7, 1.9, which I find hard to believe. But even if you buy that story and you look at what the IPCC says needs to happen in terms of reducing CO2 emission, it won't happen. The end of the war will be, and the high burst of CO2 emissions during the consequences of the war will be a good time to admit to that and to discuss it. It already started in Egypt. Already there it was a, can you hear? It was a big discussion, big point of discussion whether this 1.5 target will be maintained or not. And the question then is, does that mean that people get cynical and nobody wants to hear about the energy transition anymore? Or does it mean that the transition will be perceived as just as important, but the means will change a little bit? Assuming it is the latter, then I think becomes relevant the third and last point. Most governments will have more fiscal constraints than before the war. There are exceptions. China is in its old world. The US may get away with a recession, which is not really very bad, but certainly in Europe, and for the aggregate of the G7, the high expenditures for supporting energy consumption, the high expenditures for security, plus the general global development don't bode very well for them. So the fiscal constraints on the energy transition, assuming the will to go forward with it still exists, which I do assume, will be much more tightening. Now we have the process into place. What kind of consequences would that have from the perspective of investors, governments, and every one of us? I think the big consequence is that, whether it's called that or not, that the link between energy policy and climate policy, the interface will be evaluated more carefully. I think fiscal prudence will be important. That means subsidies will be harder to get, and measures which are fiscally neutral or increase the government take will be much more popular. What I have in mind is in particular a carbon price. The hope is that the carbon price will go out of California and Germany and in Europe and become a much more powerful global instrument. Second, I think the consequence will be a shift towards private sector activity. There will have to be the creation of more competitive conditions through the price mechanism and through other mechanisms to allow the private sector to keep its share of the burden and to lead to the kind of technological innovation which we all desire. Footnote here, financing will become very important, and a market which most people don't have on their radar now will become tremendously important. That is the market for offsets, created to finance the transition and also to allow for more biodiversity, and so which now promises to be a very unregulated, very large mess. But it becomes important and hopefully will not end as badly as the European predecessor. And then the last bit of that, if climate change remains important, then I think at least in this area, we will see continued need and push for globalization, for financing across borders, for political regulation across borders, for the adjustment of carbon prices across borders. So if the world moves backward in other areas, becomes more nationalistic and all that, this should give us an impetus forward into a more integrated global world. So that's what I meant when I said at the beginning, most likely this energy crisis is going to slow down the transition, but hopefully in the right direction to make it a more successful task. The important part is all of these things would have happened anyway. Not as fast, not as huge, not as dramatic, but in the initial thinking that you can just substitute is wrong and it's actually a more complicated problem than that, then all these things maybe we should be grateful that they popped up now and that they popped up early and so heavy that we still have more time and impetus to correct them. Thank you.